There we go.
Okay, we all set?
We're all set.
Well, welcome everyone to the January meeting of the M&A Forum, our first meeting of the year, and it's great to see that so many folks on the call here today, and hope that people had a productive holiday season. So as we move into our session today, here's our agenda for today. I've been reading our featured speakers bio. I think this may be the most intelligent person we've ever had at the M&A Forum. I mean, this he has more degrees and accolades than I've ever seen. So really looking forward to it, and particularly his outlook as it relates to some of the energy markets. So that's one of his areas of expertise. So we've completed our net weaving session, and Mike, can I flip it to you for a few words?
Sure. I extend my welcome as well to everyone. I know people are still clicking on. If people had a little bit of challenge, so apologize. So one of these days we'll quit doing Zoom and we'll actually get in the same room, right, Austin?
Absolutely, looking forward to it.
Yeah, so am I. That's why I was intent on getting my application in for a vaccination time. So
Great.
Hopefully I'll be all ready to go. Looking forward to the program. Really, it's going to be very interesting. The business community came out swinging this morning for, at least on CNBC, for what is so-called ESG, I think, environmental safety and governance in a big way, which obviously rolls into what we might expect from the traditional oil and gas sector, and also what we might expect from some of the alternative energy sectors that I know that, at least in Houston, we've been trying to develop through the Greater Houston Partnership and other folks. So really looking forward to it. You want to roll up the next slide, Bob, and we'll just remind people, this is the M&A Forum. What are we all about? We're trying to build trusted relationships, trying to build an M&A community with business owners, buyers, and service providers. And really looking forward to having the community built up where we're growing private enterprise that results in enhanced value for everybody. That's really a key to what we've been doing for the last 13 years. And we thank our sponsors tremendously for their support. Allows us honestly to reach out and do some things in the community, such as the scholarship and some other things. So for the pure business side, I'll turn it over to Mr. Bob and let him give you a few updates on what's going on here. I think you're muted, Bob.
Yeah, first of all, before we get into the DealWorks, I think everybody got the notice that our good friend and longtime member and one of the earliest members of the forum, Nick Nails, passed away. Unfortunately, I hope everybody got the email. His family has asked that if, instead of sending flowers or anything else, that you donate to the rodeo, livestock and rodeo education fund. So the forum has done that. Anybody else who would like to do that, the information to get that done is on the email I sent out. If you didn't get it, somebody needs to mute themselves. If you didn't get the information, email me at president@M&A Forum, and I'll send it to you. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide. There you go. We're getting more and more excited about the long-promised M&A Forum deal listing facility. We're still wrestling with some technical issues. We're into testing. You can see that we've got, Jack has put up one of his deals. Hopefully we'll have this up and going in a couple of weeks. the idea here is that annual members and sponsors can list deals, and everybody in the world can look at the deal listings. So we hope this is going to generate a lot more deal flow among the members and a lot more opportunities for the members to take advantage of this year. So I think that's about all I had.
Great. Okay.
Bob, before we get started, I have one late breaking item of business, at least to congratulate Jack Chang. You mentioned Jack putting up his deal, and one of his transactions from last year was selected by somebody. I was trying to pull up the organization, but was selected as one of the, I think, top 15 lower middle market transactions for 2020. So congratulations to Jack Chang and his firm for that honor. So
Yeah, good.
That's awesome. Good for Jack.
Yeah, I thought, and they closed something in December, so I think they had a pretty good year despite a challenging environment from economic and health perspective. So again, congratulations to them.
It's great. Good deal. Good deal.
Okay, sorry to interrupt, Austin.
No problem. No, absolutely. That was.
You're about to introduce somebody who's almost as smart as you are. I know. But,
jury's out. Jury's out. So thanks, Mike. So I would like to take a moment and introduce our featured speaker for today, Dr. Bill Gilmer, who's going to provide a 2021 economic outlook. So I don't know, I'll speak for myself, but just very excited to hear about this because of what all that transpired in the last 12, 14 months here. But Dr. Gilmer is currently the director of the Institute for Regional Forecasting at the University of Houston's Bauer College of Business. And in that role, he monitors economic activity and factors as it relates to the Gulf Coast business cycles. He specializes or addresses oil markets, the national economy, global expansion, and the regional economy. So I'm very, very excited because I want to piggyback on something that Mike had said. I was watching CNBC this morning as well, and one of the big hedge fund guys, it was Mike, Fink from BlackRock. He was talking about their organization was divesting of companies who didn't have a strong path forward to zero carbon neutrality. And so I guess what I was able to catch was by 2050, so many companies are moving towards a zero carbon footprint. So it'd be interesting if Dr. Gilmer, if you have any insights on that. So that's the advantage of being the facilitator. You get to ask your questions first. So educationally, Dr. Gilmer has a MA, master's and a PhD in economics from UT Austin, and then did his undergraduate work at University of Texas at El Paso. Retired from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas after 23 years, and where he served as in operations there and principal economic forecasting position. And God, he's done so many great things. I think I'm just going to flip it to him so he can get started, because we'll be here the rest of the morning talking about his academic accomplishments. So, Dr. Gilmer, we'll flip the microphone to you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me get my. Okay, let's see if I can get my screen up now. Let's see.
There we go.
All right, can you see the slides up on the screen now?
Yes, we can.
All right,
we can.
get the slide show up, and we should be able to get started here.
There we go.
All right. Well, the focus is on Houston today, and I'm going to stay really narrowly on Houston, but at the same time, over the years, I've given this talk a lot of times, and it's always been sort of this parade of first the US economy, then the global economy, then oil and its importance to Houston. And then pull it all together and draw the conclusions about where Houston stands and where Houston is likely to go based on sort of these fundamental factors. And today it's pretty much the same, except I'm going to give a short shrift really to the US and global economies, because it's sort of necessary at this point in time. It's because we're all basically in the same global boat right now, thanks to the epidemic. If you, I say the same global boat, if you could imagine a little boy sitting on a bridge and his fishing pole is out over the bridge, and here's the trend growth pattern, and then suddenly the fishing line drops right down into the water. Well, that fishing line dropping into the water is March and April of last year, and it holds for virtually every country, every state, every metro area, every industry, and you see the same chart just over and over again. So today's agenda, and we still have plenty to talk about. Today's agenda, I'm going to take a quick look at COVID and the chart you see here, and just how a pandemic affects the economy and some definitions, so we're all on the same point. We'll look at the recent performance of Houston in the US, ask how bad this downturn really is. There's such a focus on the terrible employment news, and move on to oil. Oil has been on a roll of really 6 tough years, and right now it becomes harder and harder to see that there's not going to be much of a break in that trend as we move forward. So we will pull all of that together. I have a ton of slides. I don't intend to explain every slide. They just illustrate the story that we have to tell. So I'm going to go through them fairly quickly. We can make the slides available to you after the presentation is over, for sure. So how does COVID affect economic conditions? How would we think about it? And sort of before the mandatory stay-home orders and before the closings of broad closings of non-essential businesses that we saw, the rules were different, a little different for pandemics. Basically, pandemics were expected to create very widespread illness, and that brought on primarily labor shortages and supply chain disruptions that affected the economy, potentially in serious ways. We saw the labor shortages, of course, of people getting ill or having to take care of others. And we saw those labor shortages, for example, in the meatpacking industry with this pandemic. In the Spanish flu, it was telephone operators and trolley car conductors disrupting communications and transportation. Part of every pandemic in the past has been reactive social distancing. We fear being close to each other. We avoid crowds, stores, bars, restaurants, public transportation. It's part of the game once the pandemic or epidemic is underway. And in a lot of cities, these mandatory public orders have been long used to control the disease. Again, limits control the size of crowds, closing bars and restaurants, closing schools, travel restrictions, but they were sporadic. You could see in Philadelphia, a couple of these might be imposed at any given time and would come and go over time. In Boston, a different pair at a different time, and so on, Kansas City, San Francisco. The idea of these widespread and coordinated mandatory stay-home orders across every metro area in the US at the same time in March and April was an entirely new feature. It had the effect of pulling the economic damage forward to a point early in the pandemic, hopefully to ease later infection rates, but at the same time, it certainly scared the daylights out of everybody when they were imposed. And then once these stay-home orders are lifted, they're by themselves, they turn out to be a very partial solution, and reactive social distancing and other mandatory public health orders sort of keep the employment figures depressed as we move forward. And finally, as this vaccine is widely distributed, the contact sensitive unemployment and public health impacts should slowly disappear this year and we can talk about some sort of return to normal conditions. The chart that you see on the left side here, this is that fishing line chart I was talking about. The blue line is the US, the red line is Houston. You see the trend growth upward, and then that sharp drop in March and April. 20 million jobs lost in 2 months in the US, 265,000 jobs lost in Houston in that same 2 months. Houston doesn't go in as deeply, much less restrictive lockdown measures in Houston and Texas, and deeper in the US and a bigger bounce back in the US. And I think that bounce back largely attributable to the fact that the lockdown measures were more severe across the rest of the country. And on the right, you see Houston's other problem is oil, tied, of course, to COVID, at least partly. Houston's problems this time around actually began as early as 2018 in oil with a major credit crunch. And it was COVID actually that drove the complete collapse in oil markets that we saw in April and May. On the right side of this chart, you can see a list of 9 sectors that are extremely sensitive to close contact with people. Healthcare, retail, food service, finance, other services like barbers, beautician, nail salons, auto mechanics, private education, entertainment, accommodation, air transportation. These are heavily employment intensive industries, and they make up about 40% of all the jobs in Houston. 1.3 million Houstonians work directly in these sectors. And they accounted for about 60% of the job losses that we saw in March and April. Many of them regarded as non-essential, and others just on the basis of that contact sensitivity. We saw the loss of about 240,000 jobs in that period. A nice bounce back, but at the same time, a very partial bounce back, like we have seen in total employment. This chart on the left side just shows you the month-to-month change in total employment in the red line, and in social distancing, contact sensitive industries on the blue line. You see the collapse, the fall in March and April, and you can see the very large part played by those 9 industries. And virtually all of the recovery that we see immediately following the downturn, that recovery in May and June and July, almost all of that can be attributed to those contact sensitive industries. Then you remember in July and August, we had our own COVID outbreak that saw a lot of restrictions reimposed. But even after they were lifted, you can see we're not making a lot of progress. Even after many of the restrictions are gone, it's COVID, it is the contact sensitive industries, it is reactive social distancing that leaves us with many of the losses we're seeing now. And we're not going to see those really go away until the vaccine is largely in place. This just shows you the drop in the unemployment rate here locally. The increase in the unemployment rate, which jumped from just under 4%, around 3.8%, up to 14.6% almost overnight. And we have struggled to bring that down again, even after many of the stay-home restrictions were gone. You can see that we've hovered right at 8 and 9%, above Great Recession levels, for example. And in terms of the number of people left unemployed after compared to February, for example, we still, compared to February, have about 184,000 people that are out of a job today. So these numbers are horrible, there's no question. This is just another look at similar numbers. This is the initial and continued claims for unemployment here. If you're eligible for unemployment, if you have a payroll job under the unemployment compensation program, if you're separated from your employer, you can file an initial claim. And what you see is Texas and the US compared on the left side of this chart. And you see it's a very similar decline both across the rest of the country and Texas. Texas lags a little bit in both these charts. And I think, again, it's because the lockdown was much more stringent in the rest of the country. And they sort of had a longer runway to get their recovery started. Continued claims on the right. These initial claims can be filed, but other people are dropping off the rolls at the same time. This is the net number of people who continue on unemployment. Slower again in terms of recovery in Texas, but we've pretty much caught up with the rest of the country in terms of that recovery, although we still have about 400,000 Texans out of a job today compared to where we were back last February. This left side switches from US and Texas to a comparison of Houston and Texas. And you can see there is virtually no difference. They're like twins in terms of the behavior over time. Houston makes up about 25% of the state's economy, 25% of its employment, 25% of its initial claims. The chart on the right is continuing claims. It looks different because I don't have weekly data on those continuing claims. In Houston, only have monthly data. But you can see similar comparison to Texas and Houston on continued claims, but the continued claims fall about a month later in Houston. I would attribute much of that to the fact that we really didn't see energy fall until May. Okay, so the numbers on employment are terrible. This chart on the left is the one I showed you initially, the classic fishing pole chart, and it's the really bad news that we received with the loss of 350,000 jobs. The chart you see on the right is the fishing pole chart turned upside down. This is just turned over, and this is a huge jump in personal income. Total personal income in the United States jumped by over $2 trillion in a very short period of time. And I think we can guess why that was. It was the other shock, just like there was a COVID shock in the economic data. You find a tremendous shock from the stimulus package itself. In terms of cash, $2.5 trillion in a short period of time. This is referring back to the March-April stimulus. About $1.5 trillion of that went directly into the pockets of either individuals or small businesses supporting jobs. And then, of course, on top of that, trillions of dollars in Federal Reserve stimulus with the return of the 2008-2009 playbook again, zero rates, quantitative easing, forward guidance, all of the 2008 credit facilities come back. And this is
Dr. Gilmer, can I interrupt real quickly? I had a question about
Sure.
the unemployment numbers that you shared. Mike was wondering, did those numbers also account for the gig workers, those transitional workers who don't have, let's say, steady W-2 type employment?
No, we don't really have good numbers for, we do, that there is there's a piece of the compensation package that covers many of those workers. This counts unemployment, however, only among the payroll component. We just don't get good data. The data is not reliable anyway, and it's very unreliable if you try to get into those gig workers. So I've just stuck with the more reliable data here. So no, they're not included in those unemployment numbers. Those are simply the state compensation as it would be imposed in the past during a moment of crisis, during a moment where the compensation actually will change over time depending on the state of the economy. And this would be a period of time comparable to the Great Recession, that unemployment is comparable to what was happening at that time, for example, in terms of the benefits that are available.
Great, thank you.
Sure. income-related activity is compared here. The chart you see on the left compares personal income and compensation. Compensation at the bottom of the chart is that red line. And that red line is wages and salaries and what is earned. It does include here what is earned by the self-employed, gig workers and small business. And you can see a big drop in April and May and June, and then in June it begins to recover. And compensation is now actually well above the February level. Each month in this chart is a comparison back to February. In other words, March is compared to February, June compared to where we were in February. So by the time we get to November, total compensation, which includes no stimulus, is well above where we were back in February. And total personal income, which does include the stimulus, spikes, of course, back in April and May, but that total personal income is still about 2 or 3% above where we were back in April. The stimulus is largely worn off. That old stimulus package is largely worn off by this time. What you see on the right is a very similar comparison. The red line on the bottom is personal consumption and the top after tax income. And personal consumption has basically recovered. The missing pieces here are things like air travel, entertainment, and contact sensitive industries that have not come back. You can look at goods, mostly goods related activity here in terms of US retail sales. US retail sales are up about 3% in December, about 3% above where they were back in February, with big recoveries in the auto sector, for example, e-commerce up about 15 to 20% during this downturn. What you see here is very much a COVID related pattern. Big gains in big ticket items, e-commerce, groceries, building materials for home projects, some in furniture, and in books, hobbies, and sports. And what has not done well, of course, restaurants, gasoline, clothing, and electronics. As I said, a COVID related pattern. Here in Houston, we don't have that kind of good retail data yet. It's simply not available, but we can look, for example, at autos, where you do see a COVID decline and at least a partial recovery back to February levels in terms of auto sales. That lag I would attribute partly to a shortage of autos in the US and partly to the fact that when the oil sector is down, trucks don't sell so well here in Houston. Price remains up, price recovered very quickly and has really held steady right at January, February levels in terms of the price of an automobile. And anything related to real estate in Houston has simply gone out of sight. You can see on the left side, you can see the initial drop in February and March in terms of home sales, but then look what happens in the succeeding months. First, interest rates fall, everybody gets a big check. And third, you're trapped at home with your spouse who's also trying to work. We've got 3 kids that are trying to learn from home, and another bedroom would look very tempting right now. So not only have sales soared, what was already a tight inventory here in Houston has slipped to about a 2.2 months of supply. And with shortages, with the supply that short for existing homes, you look at the right, and this is, of course, supply and demand, strong demand, limited supply, and you get that $20,000 increase in home prices in a short period of time. Builders and developers are big beneficiary here. Houston's home starts were up to 34,000 last year compared to 33,000 last year, 12-month basis. In the fourth quarter, it was the best quarter since the housing boom back in 2006 and 2007. It's an entry-level market. 84% of our sales are geared to under $300,000, and the cheaper you can make a home these days, the more houses you can sell, basically. And it's local buyers that are making up 95% of these sales. And home prices, to the extent we have the data in the third quarter, were up around 5% for new houses. So clearly the stimulus is at work here. We had an additional December stimulus package, about $1 trillion. I'll leave the details to you. The first stimulus was sometimes described as a bridge from a pre-COVID world to a post-COVID world. Sounds a little trite these days, you hear it a lot. But at the same time, it's a pretty good description of what happened. You saw the compensation numbers, for example. Most people have made it across the bridge. And I think the need for this Finn Bernanke helicopter money, dropped from on high, is increasingly less necessary than before. Certainly to the extent we could target the help to PPP to help those small businesses that are being hurt in those contact sensitive industries, to help the unemployed, I think all of that is worthy enough, because we still have months to go before this is behind us. But the need for this or another stimulus package with even more helicopter money, I have my doubts about the need for that. So let's ask the question, how bad is this downturn? How should we think about it? And some of you may remember my predecessor at the University of Houston, Barton Smith. And Bart was a huge believer in all regional economists call the economic base. And the economic base urges you to focus on those industries that are extremely that are able to sell outside the region. It's an industry, a local industry that can sell outside to the rest of the state, to the rest of the nation, the rest of the world. The best example is oil in our refinery system, for example, or oil services that we can sell across the world. And there's another big component that's not oil. You can think of Cisco, the big food distributor, maybe the big insurance, AIG insurance unit on the Allen Parkway, Men's Warehouse, Waste Management, those kinds of companies that sell outside economic base. And you can see the performance on the base of the right side, where we're clearly falling into recession. The rest of the country is falling into a COVID recession, and we follow them because we can't sell to the rest of the world. There are many other, this is a small part of the Houston economy. Most of the rest of the economy, and you can look back at those 9 contact sensitive industries, they're great examples of non-basic secondary service sector industries that are followers. They really can't influence the course of growth here in Houston. Low multipliers, they wait for something to happen in the base and then they can grow. And if you put them together and you look at oil plus not oil, you can see sort of what has happened to this economic base, to these critical jobs that drive the future for us. And you can see a big hit in March and April, an attempt at a recovery, and yet it looks like we're still sliding into recession here in Houston as these numbers have been continued to be revised. And basically what they're telling us is that we are having put aside these secondary industries and the COVID damage, and apart from that, what's happening in the rest of the country is causing a moderate underlying recession here in Houston. 5 recessions from our past are listed here. From 1990 to 1996, 5 important downturns in the Houston economy. And on average, the economic base lost about 54,000 jobs, about 11% fall in the economic base. This time we've lost about 62,000 jobs at the worst moment, about a 12% fall in the economic base. That tells us we're having a recession much like anything we have seen in the past. put aside these secondary jobs where COVID is doing damage we can do nothing about, and focus on the real damage to the drivers of the Houston economy. And this is something we've seen before several times over. And it's this combination of terrible employment and a huge positive shock that comes through those stimulus payments. So,
Dr. Gilmer, can I another quick question that relates to that slide? So this came from Bob Vinson. He had heard that due to the weather in the Far East, demand for LNG has skyrocketed, boosting energy companies. Any comments on that?
demand for LNG
Yes,
and demand where in the far, you said
in the Far East as a result of the weather.
Well, I think we're seeing some economic recovery. I know the numbers have increased both in terms of demand, the return of demand, and prices have soared twice. Once basically at mid-year, and then again recently. And it's not all just weather driven. It's partly a recovery from some of these lockdowns and a realization that we need to be shipping into Europe and Japan, for example.
Great, thank you.
Okay. What do I assume about Houston's near-term future, and as we get to a forecast here in a few minutes, is COVID-19 is going to affect Houston's economic future, our economy, until the vaccine's widely distributed. And then maybe mid-year, we begin to see some real progress in putting that behind us. Large job losses will just continue in those contact-sensitive industries. Now, once COVID is gone and those losses in bars and restaurants slide behind us, and I think that will be much easier than most people think. We have much experience in hurricanes and floods in terms of rebuilding those neighborhood retail establishments. But the recession I'm talking about is caused by what damage was done by COVID and those contact-sensitive industries across all the rest of the country. And we're going to recover together. And as that happens, Houston rises with all the rest of those boats. So we'll get to that, but let me talk about oil for just a minute here. And Houston and oil has been facing some tough times since 2014. 2011 to 2014, we had a tremendous oil boom. In 2015 and 2016, 15 and 2016, we had a tremendous oil bust. Actually, in many ways, rivals the 1980s. The oil sector in Houston lost 77,000 jobs in 2015 and 2016. As we went into recovery in 2017 and 18, only 22,000 of those jobs came back. Really a semi-permanent loss of 55,000 jobs, mostly attributable to a fracking bubble that burst back in 2014-15. So we've seen a moderate recovery, partial recovery in 2017 and 2018, but by the time you got to 2018, there was trouble again. And the trouble is the fracking industry again. You know, the fracking industry is not, it's something we've never seen before, especially if you look at industrial structure. It is, you know, this is not the Seven Sisters. This is not big multi-billion-dollar, trillion-dollar oil companies floating around the world doing multi-billion-dollar projects that take 15 years to deliver. This is more like it's small and much smaller companies. It's a competitive industries, smaller operators, price takers, assembly line production, low barriers to entry. Traditional exploration risk is largely gone. Production costs pretty well understood, and the oil is there. You tell the operator the price. If it's $40, he can pretty much tell you what's there and worth taking. And if it's $60, he can do the same for you. The problem for fracking, number one, is that it's been a high cost source of oil. It is the highest on the long run marginal cost curve for oil. it's the most expensive that works. And that means it is the marginal barrel as price goes up and down. And it's also an industry that attracted a lot of companies that I think that were less interested in being in the oil industry and more interested in a rising stock market and using low interest rates to try to make a killing. As soon as interest rates began to rise in 2018, a lot of those companies could not deliver the goods in terms of the quality of their company, and they could not deliver based on stock market gains any longer. So we saw that wave of delistings and bankruptcies in 2019, and certainly rising sharply. You can see the producers, the billions of dollars in debt that fell into bankruptcy. By the time we got to early 2020, it looked like the bankruptcies were behind us. Those Haynes and Boone bankruptcy numbers fell back really sharply. And there was sort of solid core, solid heart of the industry that was going to face a lot of financial stringencies in getting their balance sheet in shape. But we thought that a good chunk of the industry was going to make it through, that it was going to be okay. And then, of course, comes COVID, the Saudi oil war, and we're in big trouble. And frankly, the recovery still remains slow and partial. And it looks like $40 per barrel is going to be $50 a barrel is going to be sort of ceiling as we move forward, with a lot of trouble getting past that $50 mark, at least until we get through 2022. COVID, a big piece of this, of course. Gasoline demand is still down about 12%, jet fuel down about 40%. And remember, this is a global industry where these vaccinations and recovery and demand are going to take longer than what we're talking about in the US. The rig count, that traditional measure of oil field activity, you can see the long slide from 2013, 14, 2,000 working rigs down to 251 rigs working by the time we got to the worst moment of the COVID crisis. And recovery's underway, and the activity in the oil fields is starting to really accelerate right now. But so far, it's been a long, slow recovery. And if you go to the other end of the industry and look at the data where the fracturing and the completion is done, it's a very similar chart at this point in time, with an initial recovery just getting started and looking solid. We only lost, and I'd say lonely, let's put that in quotes, okay? Only lost 31,000 jobs, not the 72,000 left previously, because the industry had pretty much right-sized going into this downturn. It was not the bubble that burst back in 2014. And the losses, of course, shared by the services and the closely related fabricated metals and machinery industries. And here's the rub going forward. I haven't built this into the forecast yet. I haven't even started that. And I'm not sure what to do. But first of all, two big problems, an uncertain future for this industry in two senses. First is the financial problems, which continue. The appropriate analogy is sort of a switch from thinking of them as a growth stock to a value stock, if you will. The value stocks, the growth stock provides sharp appreciation. The only reason you invest in it is for the stock, assuming that you're going to make money on the increase in equity value. If we start looking at COVID, fracking as a value stock that doesn't appreciate, stockholders have to be rewarded by regular dividend payments. We're talking about shifting maybe 30% of cash flow to the stockholder, and that means less investment in the oil fields and perhaps a permanent fall, semi-permanent at least, in the rig count, several years of perhaps 15%. So difficult, still stringent times ahead. And a new Biden administration the list of the administrative and legislative changes they have already thought up to shrink the industry is long. They've already re-entered the Paris Climate Accords. They're working on getting out of the Iran agreements, and Iran is already shipping oil, assuming that nobody's going to enforce it. They're banning fracking on federal lands and waters, harsh regulation of flaring in the Permian Basin, and on and on. This is going to be a difficult 4 years at least for the industry as we move forward. On the global economy, very little to tell you. About a 4% decline last year in the global economy in terms of shrinking, and you can see nothing but negative signs as you move through that list of advanced and emerging and developing countries. The U.S. actually looks pretty good compared to the rest of that list, and the economic interpretation is that's one fishing pole after another in the big COVID decline on the other side. It just depends on how severe COVID was and how severe the lockdown in each case. In terms of the outlook for Houston, first we have to think about oil prices. You can look at the future. We're currently looking at something around $52, $53 a barrel in recent days. The outlook is not to see any improvement on that. And in fact, if you go either to the futures curve, or this is actually the red line is the DOE forecast out through 2022. No improvement expected much from $45 to $50 a barrel until we get into 2023. The high and the low I made up just to give the forecast a spread, basically. But it's a tough couple of years for oil going forward on the basis of price alone, much less those other the other factors I mentioned. Now, just I want to use an example. I'm show you exactly the same thing for the Houston economy in a minute. But if you look at this blue line, this is what happened to us. And this was, first of all, oil prices did fall to around $40 per barrel, briefly lower than that, very briefly. But it was primarily a huge shock as COVID struck the oil fields. And if this had only been an oil of decline, $40 a barrel, not the COVID shock, not the rest of it, we would have just followed that blue line. We have seen oil fall a dozen times to $40 a barrel or below in Houston, and we know how it behaves. And so the rig count might have fallen down to around 500 or something above 500 and then recovered. And the point to this chart is that as COVID disappears and the damage from the shock disappears in the next few quarters, we're going to get back up on something like the red line, at least in terms of what happened historically. And so we will find ourselves somehow connecting up, following that dotted line and getting back to the real world again. It's just that no statistical model can tell us how. And in fact, you have to know a lot about COVID before I could tell you how. And it's exactly the same story as I look at the Houston economy as a whole. You can see what happened on the left with that blue line, where we are today at around just under 3 million jobs here in Houston. And if this had only been a moderate US recession, Houston recession, and $40 oil, something we've seen a dozen times in Houston, we would follow that red line. And somehow we will get back to that red line over the next few quarters. How that happens, I have no idea. You would have to tell me what the virus will do over the next couple of quarters before the vaccine's in place, and then tell me the public health response. So I made up these scenarios that you see here to help make that happen, to see if we can't just connect it based on some pure assumptions that it could be easy or it could be hard, and we wind up with a figure that looks something like this as we try to get connected back to that post-COVID world. And so we wind up with a long-term future that has first the post-COVID, what's going on now, and then try to connect back up to the future the way we have always done in the past. And if we do that, I don't want to call this a forecast, we call these planning assumptions or something. You wind up with the loss of around 190,000 jobs last year in terms of employment quarter over quarter, and then the return next year of 170,000 jobs. Why? Because social distancing and alleviation from the virus brings back the 136,000 we lost to social distancing in 2020. And then after that, we can assume the virus is behind us and we go back onto a normal business cycle. We see good news in 2022 because the US recession largely ends. Houston's recession largely ends. We see continued good news in Houston into 2023 because that's where oil begins to finally make a recovery or get relief from that $40 oil. And after that, we move back onto about a 2% growth path, which has been our historic average. So tough times, but if you push something down hard enough, it will bounce back pretty hard. I'm sure I'm going to be revising these numbers down for 24, 5, and 6 below trend because, again, of what's happening in oil and the fracking industry right now. They could easily be taking 10, 15,000 jobs off of these totals once you get to 2023 and beyond. These oil jobs that will be lost are lost not because there will be any more pink slips, I think, in the oil industry. They're jobs that won't come back. They're jobs that won't return. So,
Hey, Doctor, I could go on for several more hours. This is unbelievably fascinating.
If there's anything,
okay,
we have time for questions. I'm more than happy to.
Mike, we have time for a couple of questions.
Oh, absolutely. I got more than a couple, but we'll let some other people. I already got one in, so
Okay, great.
somebody else go, but I got a couple.
Yeah, just if you have a question for Doctor, please just take yourself off mute and pose your question, please. Thank you. This has been fascinating.
It has been fascinating.
Hi.
Look, go ahead,
I have a question.
Henry.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Sorry I was late because, I sent an email when I was late. But I just follow up with you just now for the last 10, 15 minutes speaking about the oil business. The Biden administration has stopped the Keystone pipeline. Don't you think this is going to be a boost to the industry?
Not necessarily, no. Stopping the Keystone.
Yes.
I think as you look at the longer term, it's going to impose some real problems in terms of the price of oil. That's going to take 400,000 barrels that we would have imported or could have imported out of the system. And I think OPEC has about a fair margin of about 3 million barrels or something. So as you look at fracking's already down 1 million barrels, fracking probably drop another million plus. You impose these restrictions that the administration wants, you're going to drop another million. And suddenly you're going to find that the Russians and OPEC and the Saudis are back in the driver's seat. So no, I don't really think it's good for the industry for the longer term to see Canadian oil pulled out like that.
So you don't think that it will lead to increase in prices, and if prices increase, then there will be more jobs again, there will be more activities in the U.S. shale business? You don't think?
No. I really think if you just take Keystone out by itself, maybe there's an argument to be made there. But if you take it with the rest of the factors taken together, where we're going to make it difficult to drill and make things better. We're going to make it difficult to really, it's not like you're going to be able to just go right back to drilling because the price goes up, because you can't get the gas out of the Permian Basin because flaring's not allowed. You need new pipeline capacity for relief from the flaring part of it, and they won't let you have a permit to get it out of the Permian Basin. So that combination is what gets you into trouble here in terms of moving it out. For our refinery system, it's very important. There's a really great argument for bringing that oil in here because that's what we do is refine that heavy oil. But I really see this all as working as a great formula for putting the Saudis and the Russians back in the driver's seat, the price driver's seat, without much relief for our industry at the same time.
All right, thank you very much.
And Doctor, we had another question came in from JB Linder. His comment is around our medical presence here in Houston, experiencing significant high growth. What could be the implications, and then how was this factored into your some of the analysis you shared here earlier?
Well, let's divide the industry first into two parts. First, 95% of it is the same medical industry you see in every other metro area in the United States. It is a non-basic industry. You know, we say for those service industries, you don't get rich by taking in each other's laundry. You're not selling to the rest of the world, right? And for most of the industry, you don't get rich by taking each other's pulse. That's just not going to work either. So there is an important 95, 5% of that industry, all centered right there on the campus of the Texas Medical Center and its affiliated institutions. And it's a critical piece of Houston's infrastructure, a critical piece of its growth here in Houston. And but it's the research, it is the medical schools, and to a much less extent than the world would like to believe here, or Houstonians would like to believe. Most of our medical tourism comes from the rest of the state, not the rest of the world. And it's referred here from around the state. And we have a lot of that, and it's good, but it is a fraction of what happens in oil historically here in Houston. And it's great, not cyclical. It's a nice stable piece of what we do here. But we found it very hard to get that growth. We have a lot of competitors in other parts of the country that are really ahead of us in terms of much of that biotech work. And there's a long way to go.
Okay. Question from David. This is probably our final one, Mike. Your thoughts on how Houston is going to take care of these people who are not working and those who have lost their job? So I guess that's kind of a safety nets related question. Yeah.
Well, I think that's exactly what continued relief from the federal government can do for us and can do best. Certainly, the initial packages, you have to understand, were very, very generous that were handed out to those people who were eligible for unemployment and under those gig worker rules. Something, according to the Congressional Budget Office, I think it was 80% of those who received unemployment compensation under that initial $2.5 trillion package were left better off than they would have been if they had just stayed on the job. So they were very generous payments that were made, and they're not as generous going forward, but it's not clear they need to be. Now, in terms of really helping people in need, that's a continuing problem. I'm not sure. That's a problem that will be with us long after COVID. But the short-term answer is directed relief for renters and for others who need it. And then over the longer term, well, the social safety net. It's a matter for bigger discussion.
Great.
Okay. Dr. Gilmer, this is Bob Vinson. I would like to thank you very much for this very informative talk. We'd like to invite you to drop in to our meetings anytime you want.
All right, thank you.
We have monthly meetings. you are now on our contact database, so we'll be spamming you.
Okay.
So you'll get announcements of the meetings and all the connect information. I'd also like to ask you, would you be willing to come back, say June sometime, and just let us know how things are going and whatever changes you've made in your perspective?
Sure. Yeah, I'll be glad to. I usually do the forecast in conjunction with, I do some revenue forecasting for the city of Houston and Metro. And I usually finish those up about the middle of March or the middle of June, for example. Usually
Okay.
the middle of the 3rd or 6th or 9th month.
Well, whatever would fit into your schedule, we'd love to have you back and just give us an update.
I'd be glad to do that. Just let me know.
Appreciate it very much and thank you.
Sure.
It's
Anytime.
it's kind
Oh,
of
and
like the
let me
Hotel
send you-
California, Bill. Once you're in, you can check out, but you can never leave. So
Bob, I sent you some slides earlier. Let me send
Yes,
you a package of slides that you can share with the group.
we are going to distribute those probably this afternoon.
Okay, there were I saw a couple of typos as I actually read my own slides. So,
Well, we all suffer from that, don't we?
yeah, I'm sure there's still typos in it. I usually make my best typos straightening up the last one.
Thank you again.
All right, great. Nice meeting all of you. I
Thank
enjoyed
you.
it.
thanks so much, Bill. I really appreciate that. It was very engaging, as a matter of fact. And yeah, it would be great if maybe June or July, after you've done your updates, you come back and at least give us a thumbnail of what's going on. That would be fantastic. Thanks to everybody for joining us today. Leave you with a thought, which is something I think we're all getting used to as this pandemic has rolled into its 2nd year almost now, and perseverance. Strangely enough, 2 Jobs have discussed perseverance, one from a very, very long time ago and one from a more recent Job. But keep in mind that we do have a long race to run, and look forward to additional good deals like the one that Jack and his group have been doing. The next meeting is 23rd or 24th. Well, it's on the schedule. So look forward to seeing everyone in February. We'll get information about the program out to you as soon as we can. I don't know, Austin, Bob, anything else for the good of the order, or we let these good people
Yeah,
go?
just one more
back to
thing,
work?
Mike. For those of you who had trouble getting on or missed part of Bill's presentation, recording of the whole meeting will be available on our website probably next week. So you can get in and see the whole thing.
I guess for those of you who remember Nick Nail, again, I call your attention to that. He was a really, really good friend and a great participant in the forum. So I guess my sympathies to his family and commend his soul to the good Lord. So
Amen.
have a great month. We will see everybody here in February, 4th Tuesday, as we always do.
Good deal.
Thanks,
All right,
Austin.
thanks. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Okay.